Michael Foster had hoped for a peaceful start. Instead, he was greeted with an HOA welcome packet and a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves as Michael stepped into the small HOA office just off Maple Avenue. The place reminded him of a credit union from the 1980s, wood veneer counters, a clock that ticked audibly, and a pump bottle of hand sanitizer positioned precisely next to a bowl of candy corn. Linda Carver, standing behind the desk in a beige pantsuit and pumpkin brooch, extended the packet with two hands like it was a diploma. "We're a proud little community here," she said, her tone bright but her eyes cool. "This will get you up to speed. Covenants, procedures, architectural standards. Nothing too complicated." Michael smiled politely and reached for the envelope. Before he could say much, a rustle of paper came from behind, Walter Foster, his father, running his fingers across a bulletin board plastered with seasonal notices. "They always hide the real rules in the small print," Walter said under his breath, squinting at a faded flyer about fence color approvals. Linda didn't seem to hear, or chose not to. Instead, she turned her attention to a stack of laminated HOA cards, selected one marked Foster M, and handed it to Michael. "You'll need this for resident parking," she said. "And Janet will show you how to register for the Fall Welcome Festival." Janet Harris, seated behind a side desk, glanced up. Her cardigan was 2 shades darker than the pumpkins printed on it, and her glasses slipped slightly down her nose as she handed over a flyer. "It's this Saturday," she said softly. "Just down at the park by the creek. Bonfire and cider. Folks bring pies." "Sounds nice," Michael replied. Janet offered a faint smile, then hesitated. Her fingers tapped the edge of the flyer before she added, almost in a whisper, "Some folks here don't like change." Walter tilted his head slightly. Michael caught the gesture but said nothing. Instead, he thanked them both, tucked the paperwork under his arm, and followed Walter out. The wooden door closed behind them with a muted thud. Clearwater Pines looked postcard perfect that afternoon. Every porch bore some variation of seasonal decor, hay bales, fake crows, or elaborate gourds lined up like awards. Children zipped down the sidewalks on scooters, their jackets flapping, while someone raked leaves under the rhythm of a portable radio playing a country tune. Back at their small bungalow near the edge of the neighborhood, Michael eased open a cardboard box labeled "Kitchen, Fragile" and began the ritual of unpacking. Walter had already taken up post at the dining table, reading glasses on, a red pen in one hand and the HOA bylaws spread before him like a general preparing a battle map. He said nothing for a while, flipping pages. The old enamel kettle on the stove began to whistle. Walter rose, shut off the flame, poured hot water into 2 mugs, one chipped, one clean, and set them both down. "You know what this reminds me of?" he asked, pointing to a highlighted section about mailbox heights. "Bank foreclosure clauses from the late 90s. Same phrasing, same tone. They just swapped loan for landscape." Michael glanced up from unpacking utensils. "Meaning?" Walter circled a phrase in bold. "Non-compliant development shall be subject to immediate abatement measures." That's not the language of community building. That's enforcement talk. "You think it's intentional?" Walter shrugged, then took a sip of tea. "I think it's been that way for a long time. And no one's questioned it." The evening came in slow. Outside, streetlights blinked on, casting golden pools onto quiet sidewalks. Michael finished organizing the cabinets while Walter, now settled on the couch, clicked on an old rerun of Matlock. The familiar music and grainy picture wrapped the room in something close to comfort. As Michael reached to close the front door for the night, a movement caught his eye. He bent down and found a small envelope tucked just beneath the welcome mat. No name. No return address. Just a folded piece of paper with neat, looping handwriting that read, "Watch the driveway. Welcome to Pines." Michael trimmed a bush near the driveway and found a $75 violation in his mailbox the next morning. The paper was stiff, cream-colored, and folded with precision. The HOA seal at the top was embossed in gold, lending the thin notice an air of formality that felt strangely theatrical. Michael stood on the porch in his flannel, coffee mug steaming in his hand, staring at the citation like it might change if he blinked. Walter joined him, squinting at the envelope over his shoulder. Unapproved landscaping modification, Michael read aloud. What landscaping? You mean the bush? Walter asked, sipping his own mug. Michael nodded toward the driveway, where the small holly shrub had loomed over the edge of the sidewalk. He had trimmed it the day before, clipping back a few limbs that had started to obstruct foot traffic. It hadn't looked like a protest, just yard work. Walter reached into his sweater pocket and handed over a pair of reading glasses. Read the second paragraph, he said. Michael adjusted the glasses and scanned the dense block of text. Per Article 4, Section 3.2 of the Clearwater Pines Architectural Code, any alteration to exterior foliage visible from the street must receive prior written approval from the HOA Architectural Subcommittee. Walter huffed softly and returned to his chair beside the porch railing, his breath fogging faintly in the crisp morning air. It's never about the bush, he said, lifting his newspaper. It's about the precedent. Later that morning, Walter made his way to the Maple Grove Cafe. It was half full, truckers near the window, a group of ladies with crochet bags by the counter, and the regular clink of ceramic mugs on saucers. The smell of bacon, burnt toast, and slightly overbrewed coffee hung in the air like an old story. He found an empty booth and slid in, nodding at the waitress without needing to order. She already knew, 2 eggs over easy, rye toast, black coffee, no sugar. A few moments later, a familiar face appeared near the condiment station, Mrs. Tomlin, her hair tucked under a knitted cap, her cane tapping rhythmically against the tile floor. She spotted Walter and veered toward him. You're the son, aren't you? She said, easing herself into the booth opposite. From Elm Street. Guilty, Walter replied, smiling faintly. Michael's the buyer. I'm just the consultant. She leaned in, glancing around with a mischievous glint in her eye. She wrote you up for a bush? Walter nodded. Yesterday. She wrote me up once for wind chimes. She chuckled. Said they were aesthetic noise pollution. I said she was constitutional overreach in a cardigan. Walter allowed himself a rare laugh. Their food arrived, and he tipped the waitress 3 crisp bills on a $7 tab. As he dabbed the corners of his mouth with a napkin, Mrs. Tomlin added in a low voice, You might want to speak with Janet Harris. That girl sees more than she lets on. Later that afternoon, Michael made his way to the HOA office. Thanksgiving banners had appeared since his last visit, turkey cutouts, orange and brown garlands, and a display of old corn husks that looked like they'd been reused for years. It gave the place a cheery, if slightly tired, warmth. Janet sat at her desk, typing slowly with 2 fingers. She looked up as he entered and gave a small nod. Michael raised the notice and tilted it toward her without a word. She blinked, then stood and walked over. I saw it, she said softly. You trimmed a bush. That's the claim. She scanned the hallway, then spoke quietly. There's a list. People who question things. The board, they keep track. Michael furrowed his brow. Track how? They mark your file. You get monitored, compliance visits, targeted notices. It's subtle. Never in writing. But it happens. He paused. That's legal? Janet shook her head. Probably not. But nobody's challenged it. Back home, Michael relayed the conversation to Walter, who had just finished organizing a stack of old HOA newsletters by year. Paper trails are everywhere, Walter said, flipping through one. The trick is spotting the pattern. That evening, Michael returned to the HOA building. Lights were still on inside, though the front door was locked. He circled around the side and paused by the open window of the staff room. Inside, Linda Carver sat alone at her desk, her phone on speaker, voice sharp. We need to show them early who's in charge, she said. Michael took a quiet step back, heart suddenly heavier. At home, Walter sat with the violation notice under a lamp. He held a red pen in one hand and a folded memo from an old bank file in the other. After a moment of silent comparison, he exhaled slowly. Same structure. Same tone. 3-line indents, passive phrasing, vague enforcement. I've seen this 100 times, he said. She's not just power-hungry. She's sloppy. That's useful. The concrete blocks arrived with no warning. Linda called it visual regulation. Michael called it a wall. They stood like silent sentinels at the edge of the Foster driveway, 4 rectangular slabs, painted in a drab municipal yellow, spaced evenly but close enough to make entry nearly impossible. Michael blinked at them from the porch, steam curling from his coffee mug as the wind tugged at the sleeve of his jacket. No note this time. Just presence. Walter joined him a moment later, tugging a cardigan tighter around his shoulders. Subtle, he said. Michael gestured toward the barrier. They said it's about visual uniformity. That cars shouldn't be too close to the sidewalk. Walter raised an eyebrow. Uniformity in a neighborhood with candy cane poles and plastic reindeer on half the lawns? Michael exhaled through his nose. I called the HOA. Janet said I'd need to submit a formal request to dispute it. Linda wasn't available. Walter looked past the blocks, gaze narrowing. We'll see about that. Later that morning, Walter sat at his desk in the corner of their den, the same flickering brass lamp lighting a pile of HOA newsletters, legal pads, and property files. The wind rattled the windowpane gently as he slipped an old cassette into the tape player. Saxophone and soft piano floated through the room like memory. He lifted the receiver of their landline and dialed. Delaney, a familiar voice answered after 2 rings. Harold, Walter said, I've got a question that smells like old varnish. I'm listening. Ever heard of Linda Carver applying for a community empowerment mortgage? Around 2018. There was a pause. Some paper shuffling. I remember her name, Delaney replied. She went through the pilot program. High-risk neighborhood designation, but the ethics clause was strict, had to prove community involvement, no abusive practices. Walter smiled faintly. That clause still binding? Unless refinanced through a separate lender. Want me to check? Already did, Walter said, tapping a printed form on his desk. County record still lists the original bank. Delaney chuckled. Then she's dancing on a frozen pond. While Walter worked, Michael stepped outside to get the mail, passing a cluster of bundled-up children walking to the school bus stop. One boy pointed to the yellow blocks. Looks like jail, he whispered. His mother hushed him gently. From the HOA office, Janet sent a single-line email, please come in. Quietly. Michael arrived after lunch. The seasonal banners fluttered above the doorway, turkeys, harvest leaves, scripted welcome home signs that now felt ironic. Janet met him in the hallway, clipboard in hand but eyes scanning for others. I can't say much, she murmured. But there are things in the archive. Old meeting minutes. Financials. Things she had sealed 2 years ago. Michael tilted his head. Sealed? Only the president can access them. Walter was already steps ahead. That evening, after dinner, he returned to his desk and opened the county clerk's digital records again. Fingers slow but precise, he followed property lines and financing trails. And there it was, Linda Carver's signature on a mortgage contract dated July 2018. Below it, under subsection B12, all recipients must demonstrate and maintain ethical stewardship in community governance. Walter leaned back in his chair, the tea beside him still warm. He reached for his metal letter opener, used it to smooth the fold in the printout, and clipped it to a fresh manila folder marked, Carver, Liability. A passing neighbor waved through the front window. Walter nodded in return, the cassette still playing something mellow and knowing. He stood and crossed the room, paper in hand. Michael looked up from the kitchen counter. Walter placed the record down and tapped the clause with his index finger. She signed her own checkmate 5 years ago. She just doesn't know it yet. Some people fight with signs and protests. Walter used a clause buried in a 6-year-old loan contract. Outside, the wind howled across Clearwater Pines, lifting brittle leaves into the air like forgotten promises. The sky was low and gray, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and damp bark. Thanksgiving was days away, but there was no holiday cheer inside the Foster home, only the soft hum of a dot matrix printer and the occasional clink of a teaspoon against a ceramic mug. Walter leaned over the kitchen table, papers spread out in a lattice of old bank documents and HOA records. His reading glasses slid to the tip of his nose as he scrolled through the scanned mortgage form once more. A low crackle buzzed from the radio on the counter, an AM channel murmuring about weather advisories and grocery deals. Clause 7, Leadership Ethics Default. That was the language. Still intact, still enforceable. Delaney had confirmed it by email that morning, his note terse but unmistakably satisfied. If she's still acting in an official HOA capacity, she's subject to the terms. Any breach of ethical stewardship, documented and credible, triggers review. Walter clicked the pen in his hand twice before underlining the clause for the fourth time. Michael stood at the window, watching neighborhood kids chase each other past a house wrapped in orange and brown bunting. "You really think this will work?" he asked, not turning away from the glass. Walter didn't answer right away. He fed a fresh sheet into the old printer and waited for the groan and punch of the machine to begin. It chirped and spat, its work slow and deliberate. "They never read the fine print," Walter finally said. "That's where the leverage lives." Later that day, a knock came at the side door. Janet stood there, bundled in a wool coat too long for her frame, one hand clutching a brown paper bag that smelled faintly of pumpkin pie. Her breath curled in the cold air. "I brought something," she said. Michael opened the door wider, surprised. "For Thanksgiving?" She gave a tired smile. "That too. But mostly this." She reached inside her coat and pulled out a photocopied page marked HOA Board Session, Executive Notes. She handed it to Walter. "They thought they deleted this from the minutes. But I kept a backup." Walter read in silence. Near the middle of the page, a line jumped out. "Focus compliance enforcement on households with recent violations. Early pressure reduces long-term resistance." Michael let out a quiet whistle. "They're targeting people deliberately," Janet said. "It's not about order, it's about control." Walter nodded, folded the paper, and added it to the growing folder marked Carver. That evening, with the wind rattling the window panes and dinner still warm on the stove, Walter typed out a single-page formal letter titled Notice of Breach and Activation of Clause 7. He ran it through the old printer, then placed the original and 2 copies in stiff envelopes. One was addressed to the bank. One to Linda Carver. One for the file. He signed each with a slow, deliberate hand, the ink drying under the glow of the kitchen lamp. As he affixed stamps, Michael paced behind him. "She's going to retaliate," Michael said. Walter licked the final envelope and pressed it closed. "We're not poking the bear, we're enforcing the leash." The reply came faster than expected. By noon the next day, a fax chattered onto the kitchen counter. The letterhead bore the bank's logo, and the message was clear. Per the terms of the 2018 Community Empowerment Mortgage, any verified breach of community leadership ethics must be remedied within 72 hours or trigger collateral reassessment, including but not limited to property audit and lien adjustment. Walter folded the letter, tucked it into the Carver folder, and returned to his tea. By the time shadows grew long that afternoon, a low rumble echoed from the street. Michael opened the blinds just as a flatbed truck pulled up. 3 men in reflective vests stepped out, hauling pre-molded concrete barriers from the back. No signs. No courtesy call. Just blocks, heavier, taller, and broader than before. They lowered them with soft thuds across the entrance of the driveway. Michael stared, hands clenched at his sides. In the silence that followed, Walter didn't move from his chair. He just watched through the front window, the corner of his lip curling ever so slightly. Chiu Hom Du, Hoa Thu Nuoi Dat Rao Bitong Vin Vien Truoc Driveway Qua Michael. Linda expected HOA complaints, not a certified letter from her bank. The envelope had weight. Heavier than paper, lighter than panic. It sat unopened on Linda Carver's dining table beside a napkin-wrapped cornucopia centerpiece and an untouched slice of pumpkin pie. The return address was familiar, Greenstone Mortgage Group, but the red, certified stamp across the top unsettled her. She read the letter 3 times before she let herself react. Per Clause 7 of your 2018 mortgage agreement, ethical leadership violations, subject to review. The words bled into one another, their formality suffocating. By the 4th read, her hands were shaking. She set the letter down, reached for her phone, and dialed Janet. "Get Langley," she said, not waiting for a hello. "Now. And pull the communication manual, we're going to need to contain this." Outside, Clearwater Pines was a postcard of Thanksgiving warmth. Smoke curled from brick chimneys. Children ran between porches with paper pilgrim hats flapping in the wind. Households filled with the scent of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, and spiced cider. At the Foster home, things were quieter. Walter had insisted on wearing a blazer and tie for dinner, a ritual of respect carried over from a different time. The turkey breast was modest, the stuffing boxed, but the table was set with cloth napkins and silver flatware, polished until they caught the glow of the kitchen lights. Michael lifted his glass. "To quiet Thanksgivings." Walter clinked it gently. "And loud paperwork." As they ate, the doorbell rang. Michael opened it to find 2 neighborhood kids standing with their father, holding a foil-covered pie dish. "We had extras," the man said. "My wife insists on overbaking." Michael took the pie, heart softening at the gesture. "Thanks, really." Behind them, Mrs. Tomlin stood near the curb, a thick scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She raised a mittened hand in greeting and called across the yard, "It's time folks stop whispering." Word was spreading. Janet sent a text just before sundown, "She's calling an emergency meeting with Langley. Wants to lock the HOA files." Walter folded his napkin and rose from the table. "Then it's time we post a little something of our own." Outside, the wind had picked up. Flags along the community center rippled with enthusiasm, orange and brown leaves sewn into a cheerful banner that read, "Thanksgiving Dinner, sponsored by the Clearwater Pines HOA." Walter approached the notice board just beside it. From the inside of his coat, he pulled a plastic sleeve and a strip of painter's tape. He affixed the document carefully, centered, straight. The violation summary. The one Linda had received. Redacted names, but the clause at the bottom left no doubt, violation of community stewardship obligations, Clause 7 activation pending review. A couple walked by with their dog, pausing mid-step. The man leaned forward to read. The woman whispered, "Is that real?" Walter said nothing. He simply smoothed the edges of the paper, tipped his hat, and walked back toward home. Inside, the house was still warm. Michael poured the smallest amount of red wine into 2 glasses, handing one to his father. Walter took a sip, just enough to wet the tongue. "She thought she was untouchable." Michael nodded. "Is she? We'll see Monday." Walter set the glass down just as Michael's phone buzzed. A message from Janet blinked on screen. "Linda's calling for a board-only meeting Monday. You'll want to be there." Linda called for silence. The town showed up to speak. The folding chairs had been set out in neat rows, each bearing a paper sign with Clearwater Pines HOA monthly meeting printed in faint gray ink. The center's overhead fluorescence flickered with occasional stutters, casting a soft buzz beneath the swell of murmurs. It was the largest crowd in recent memory. Neighbors who rarely left their porches had filed in, some with babies, others with walkers, and the scent of home-baked cookies mixed with percolated coffee drifted from a corner table decorated with sprigs of holly and a knitted tablecloth. Linda Carver stood at the front with a clipboard and a tight smile. Her blouse, cranberry red, matched the wreath beside the podium. Mr. Langley sat to her right, fingers laced tightly. Janet hovered near the back in a faded navy sweater, her posture stiffer than usual. Walter adjusted his seat in the 3rd row, the small bronze veteran pin on his blazer catching the light. Michael sat beside him, arms folded, calm but alert. "Let's begin," Linda said, tapping the microphone. I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is a space for structured, civil dialogue. I appreciate your presence and your commitment to our shared values." She cleared her throat and began reading from her prepared statement. The HOA board has always upheld its mission to protect the aesthetic and structural integrity of our community. Our guidelines are not arbitrary, they're about preserving the value and peace of Clearwater Pines. A few heads nodded. A few did not. As part of that mission, she continued, we have implemented measures, including visual regulation blocks, to ensure compliance with long-standing covenants. Michael stood. Linda paused, her eyes narrowing. "Sir, we'll take comments at the end." "I believe this is relevant," Michael replied. "And brief." She hesitated, then gestured reluctantly. Michael unfolded a small printout. Per HOA Covenant Article 5, Section 2, no physical obstruction can be installed on a resident's property boundary without mutual consent or proven hazard. The blocks in front of our driveway were neither agreed to nor justified. A quiet ripple passed through the room. Walter rose next, paper in hand. Linda Carver signed a mortgage contract in 2018, he began, voice even, as part of the Community Empowerment Program. Clause 7 outlines an ethical leadership provision. I have a certified copy here. He held up the sheet. It stipulates that any use of authority to retaliate or discriminate within a residential community constitutes breach of terms. Langley shifted in his seat. I have verified with the issuing bank, Walter added, that this clause is still in effect. Someone near the back muttered, Lord. Linda's expression hardened. This is not. Mrs. Tomlin's voice cut through from the second row. This community used to be about neighbors, she said. Now it's about warnings taped to mailboxes. A man beside her spoke next. I was fined for hanging a U.S. flag at the wrong angle. A woman 3 rows behind, she cited my son's basketball hoop as a hazardous structure. Then Janet stepped forward, trembling just slightly. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small recorder. I didn't want it to come to this, she said. But I have audio. From multiple board meetings. Linda gave direct orders to target new homeowners. To discourage challenges. I didn't feel right keeping it quiet anymore. Langley's head turned sharply. Linda stared at Janet like she'd never seen her before. You can't, Linda started, voice rising. We're not finished, Michael said. Linda slammed her notes down on the table. None of you understand what it takes to keep order, she snapped. Do you think this place just maintains itself? I've held this together for a decade. Langley touched her arm gently. Linda, let's take a breath. Her shoulders were stiff. Eyes wide. The silence that followed felt like frost settling over the room. Walter rose again, slower this time. He didn't raise his voice. We don't want disorder, Linda. We just want our driveway back. And maybe, a bit of dignity. Linda thought resigning quietly would end it. She forgot that paper trails don't go away. The email arrived just after sunrise, subject line blank, body consisting of 2 lines. Effective immediately, I resign from my position as president of the Clearwater Pines HOA. No further comment. There was no signature, no apology. Just absence in digital form. Janet printed it, pinned it to the HOA bulletin board with a red thumbtack, and stepped away without ceremony. Snow had begun to fall softly that morning, coating rooftops and hedges with a light dusting that looked deceptively peaceful. Inside the Foster home, the scent of cinnamon lingered from breakfast, and a string of modest white lights framed the living room window. Walter sat in his usual armchair by the hearth, a wool scarf looped around his neck. Michael brought him a mug of tea and laid a steady hand on his father's shoulder. Walter didn't look away from the legal pad on his lap. The real end never comes with shouting, he murmured. It comes with silence, and a signature. Despite the resignation, Walter dropped a manila envelope into the outgoing mail bin that afternoon. It contained a notarized statement of ethical breach, a copy of the Community Empowerment Mortgage Clause, and a formal request for breach review. It wasn't vengeance, It was precedent. At the HOA office, stripped now of most of its festive trappings, Janet waited for Michael by the back file room. The air inside was colder than usual, fluorescent lights buzzing weakly overhead. "She's been in here almost every evening this week," Janet whispered, trying to shred anything with her initials on it. Michael frowned. "Does she think resigning clears her name? She thinks she can bury the past. But some of us kept copies." She reached into a filing box and handed him a thin folder. Inside, a copy of a 2019 fiscal proposal, with Linda's handwriting in the margins, "Gym renovation project, to home?" The line was circled twice in blue ink. "I haven't shown this to anyone," Janet said quietly. "I figured you'd know what to do." Meanwhile, the community had not let go. A group of residents, including Mrs. Tomlin and the Delgados from Cedar Lane, circulated a petition to restructure the HOA bylaws. At the same time, a second list called for the HOA to submit written confirmation relinquishing control over all access points, including Michael's driveway. In less than 3 days, over 70 signatures had been gathered. Michael read each name as they scrolled in on Janet's old printer. Some he barely recognized. Others were neighbors who had once avoided eye contact. Linda's silence didn't last long. On a sleeting Thursday evening, she arrived at the Foster doorstep unannounced. Her coat was unbuttoned, eyes rimmed in red, hair pulled back hastily. Walter answered. "I came to speak with you," she said, voice uneven. "About all of this." Walter didn't step aside. "You've spoken plenty." She held out a trembling hand. "I didn't mean for it to spiral this way. I just wanted order. Pride in our neighborhood." "There's no clause for regret," Walter said. "Just resolution." She stood motionless, shoulders sagging. After a long pause, she turned and left without another word. The porch light caught snowflakes in her wake. The next morning, a letter arrived from Greenstone Mortgage Group. Typed in the bank's formal tone, it stated that Linda Carver's loan had been flagged for legal review. Any further community complaint filed in official record, it read, will trigger an automatic reassessment of her mortgage obligations under Clause 7. At the HOA office, Linda sat alone at her desk. The heating unit buzzed faintly overhead, trying to keep up with the cold. Her fingers rested on the edge of her inbox, unmoving. Janet watched from the doorway but said nothing. Later that evening, back at the Foster home, Michael flipped through the copied financial proposal again. The margin note glared back at him in sharp, familiar cursive. "Gym renovation project, to home." He handed the sheet to Walter, who adjusted his glasses and studied it carefully. Neither said anything for a moment. Outside, the street lamps flickered on. The snow had thickened. But inside, the quiet was no longer oppressive, it was the quiet of clarity. It took 3 months, a forgotten clause, and a quiet man with a red pen. But Michael finally parked in peace. Snow had dusted the eaves of the houses like confectioner's sugar, catching the light from the porch displays and glowing softly in the twilight. Strings of white bulbs zigzagged from rooftop to fence post, their reflections dancing faintly off the now clear concrete of the Foster driveway. It was December 24th, and Clearwater Pines smelled of gingerbread and pine. Walter stood at the edge of the yard, mug of coffee cradled in both hands. He wore his wool coat buttoned all the way to the top, scarf tucked neatly underneath. From his spot on the weathered bench just beside the porch steps, he could see the entire gathering. Children darted between the grown-ups, their boots crunching gently on the salted pavement. A long folding table sat across the driveway, filled with crockpots, foil-covered trays, and stacks of mismatched paper plates. Janet hovered near the center, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the warmth of laughter. She carried a small clipboard tucked under one arm, but tonight it didn't look like a burden. She leaned down to speak with Mrs. Tomlin, who was seated comfortably beside a portable heater, her mittens curled around a mug of cider. The old woman chuckled at something, then looked around the crowd with a kind of quiet wonder. "When good people stay quiet too long," she said gently to no one in particular, "bad rules start to look normal." Michael had spent the afternoon sweeping the last traces of gravel from the driveway, smoothing down the new deck boards at the side entrance, and stringing the last of the garland up the porch railing. Now, he moved easily among the neighbors, refilling mugs of cocoa, offering seconds of pie. He paused to greet the Wilkins twins with a gentle high five, then thanked the Delgados for bringing their famous tamale casserole. The music, soft, lilting, played from a vintage radio perched near the door. Bing Crosby's White Christmas floated gently over the breeze, harmonizing with the murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. As the evening wore on, Janet stepped forward and tapped the edge of her clipboard. The small crowd turned, quieting out of respect. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried easily. "I don't want to take up much time," she said. "But I thought tonight, before we all go home to warm fires and wrapped gifts, we should say something simple." She looked over the group, then to Walter, and finally back to Michael. "To the ones who stayed civil, stayed smart, and stayed." There were no cheers. Just nods, a few sniffles, and the kind of stillness that only happens when people truly understand each other. As the evening wound down, a few of the neighborhood teens dragged out the old community tree from storage, an artificial pine that had once been Clearwater Pine's annual centerpiece. No one had bothered with it in recent years. But tonight, they propped it up just outside the Foster driveway, stringing it with leftover lights and handmade ornaments donated on the spot. Someone fetched an extension cord. Another added a star. Michael stood back, arms crossed, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the tree. Janet approached, holding a folded paper. "We'd like to invite you to join the board," she said. "Nothing formal yet. Just think about it." Michael smiled, then shook his head gently. "I think the neighborhood has its voice now," he said. "It doesn't need mine." Janet smiled back, understanding. She tucked the paper into her coat pocket and rejoined the gathering. Later that night, after the tables had been cleared and the last goodbye had been shouted across driveways, Michael and Walter sat together on the newly finished deck. The boards were smooth beneath them, the porch light casting a warm amber circle around their chairs. The air was quiet but not empty, filled with the rustle of branches, the hum of Christmas lights, and the faint echo of a community remembering how to come together. Walter lifted his mug of hot tea, steam curling upward like ribbon. To fine print, and family. Under the quiet snow and soft porch lights, Clearwater Pines finally felt like home again, not because someone enforced the rules, but because neighbors remembered how to care. What began with a bush and a driveway ended with a community finding its voice, and a leader discovering that control built on fear can't weather the seasons. Sometimes, the smallest clause in a forgotten document can become the loudest declaration of fairness. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble. And maybe, just maybe, it's never too late to dust off the old paperwork, warm up the coffee, and help the neighborhood remember what it was meant to be.